Hi, man. Just to let you know, we'll be going live in a minute.
Okay, should be fine.
Perfect. Thank you. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. My name is Sean. I'm delighted you are joining us for today's ESBC community webinar. Today I'm joined by Aman Kumar, Microsoft, who will cover information protection SharePoint. We love hearing what you guys have to say, so remember to join in on the conversation about today's webinar and more on X. Our handle is @ESBC_community, and our hashtag is #ESBC24. Tweet us, tag us, and tell us what you learned. Don't forget to check out our Learning Hub, which is updated with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. You can access and view the Learning Hub by visiting our website, sharepointeurope.com, and clicking the Content tab at the top. Don't let the learning stop here. Continue to keep up and stay ahead by joining us for our next webinar, New Capabilities with SharePoint Pages, with Margin Summers, MVP. This webinar will take place tomorrow, Friday, the 18th of October, at 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. CEST. For more information on this webinar, please check out www.sharepointeurope.com/SharePoint Week. Late bird sale alert for #ESBC24. As part of SharePoint Week, we're offering a €100 discount on top of the current sale price for ESBC24 tickets. Use the code SharePoint Week to secure your spot. This offer is for new bookings only. Don't miss this chance to enhance your expertise in Microsoft 365, SharePoint, Azure, Power Platform, Copilot, and Microsoft Teams. Don't miss out. Register your interest today at www.sharepointeurope.com/pricing. We're excited to announce the call for speakers for EPPC 25 is officially open. This incredible event will take place in Vienna from June 16 to 19, 2025. We are looking for Power Platform experts to share their insights with a community of over 2,000 plus enthusiasts. If you're knowledgeable in Power BI, Copilot, Power Automate, Copilot Studio, Power Pages, or any other Power Platform tools, this is a fantastic opportunity to present and inspire others. Submit your session today at www.sharepointeurope.com/submit to speak EPPC. After the webinar, we'll have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you might have into the questions box. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now, I'm going to pass you over to today's webinar presenter, Aman. Hello, Aman. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello, good morning. Welcome you all on this SharePoint information protection and data security session, I would say that. And we'll be covering multiple topics throughout the journey. I think it's 1 hour session. I've tried to squeeze all these topics in 1 hour, although I can speak around a week for them, but it would be nice to go through talking about information protection and data lifecycle management in terms of SharePoint. I'll be sharing my screen. We'll be going through the topics, what we're going to cover today, I would say that, and I'll be showcasing the demos for each and respective topic. So let's get started. I'll be offering some around 5 to 10 minutes at the end so that we can have all the questions and answer ready for you guys. Now, do let me know once my screen is visible, Cian.
Yeah, I can see your screen there.
Perfect.
Yeah, I can see the presentation.
Perfect. The very first topic, what we're going to cover with respect to SharePoint information protection is sensitivity label. And we're going to talk about what sensitivity labels are, what is the scope for the sensitivity labels, and then we'll talk about manual versus automatic sensitivity label and end user experience when it comes to applying labels on the SharePoint label. So when I talk often around sensitivity labels are sort of classifications which can offer you to apply encryption and protection on the content or the file sitting on the SharePoint. I normally differentiate a sensitivity label with data loss prevention policy in terms of if I talk about the sensitivity labels, they're more persistent protection. So even if the content or data or the file going beyond or beyond the periphery of your organization, your data is quite secured because sensitivity label is saved as a metadata in the file. So even if you are sharing a file outside the organization based upon the encryption, if the user would not have access to the sensitivity label to the file via sensitivity label, they won't be able to access the file at all. So it's more secured, I would say that despite how you have defined your sensitivity label, it will be ingested as a metadata into the file. So that's like more about providing encryption and protection over the content. When I talk about the scope of the sensitivity label, we do have different scope. When we started the journey, it was more around item. So it's like content and the emails, but now we have leveraged the scope to groups and sites as well. Basically, we also refer to as containers. You can apply sensitivity label on, let's say, SharePoint sites, teams, and groups as well. You can apply sensitivity label manually. So, depending upon what sort of sensitivity label offered by the organization, you can choose different sensitivity label and apply on the files and the content. You can also apply sensitivity label on a document library level. And once you drop the file, it will inherit the sensitivity label from the document library level. And based upon the sits, that's sensitive info type. For an example, credit card information. This is just an example. We do have multiple sits available, and you can also create your custom scripts, let's say. And then based upon that, you can apply sensitivity label automatically to the data as well. That's one thing. Now, coming to the end user experience, I'll be taking you through a demo. What is sensitivity label, how to configure it, and showcasing the experience into SharePoint, which will make more sense. But just a bottom line, if I talk about the sensitivity label, I'm talking about the unified labeling or a classification which can offer encryption and protection or even watermarking onto your content sitting onto your SharePoint. I'm emphasizing on SharePoint just because this is a SharePoint sort of information protection, but apart from that, we do have different workloads, which is being covered by sensitivity label as well. So I'll just share my screen here. That's my tenant. I still hope you are able to see that. So I'm into my new portal, which is purview.microsoft.com, and I'll go to my information protection. This will leverage me in terms of, or this will offer me in terms of creating new sensitivity labels. So I'll go to my sensitivity labels and try to create a sensitivity label and showcase you different functionalities and offerings when it comes to different labels, also dependent upon different scopes. Okay, so we'll create a very first label. I will name this as ESPC confidential for an example. That's going to be the name of the label, the display name. Now, all the labels which is created newly, they would be higher in the priority. I'll talk about the significance of the priority as well. Then you have description for the users, you have description for the admin as well. Now, you can also offer color coding to your labels. I'll be showing you the end user experience. So let's say I'll have this as amber. I'll go next. These are the scopes. We won't be covering schematized data, which is like more assets towards your SQL, Azure SQL, because this session is more focusing upon SharePoint only. So you do have items, which offers you to have sensitivity labels leverage on files, emails, and meetings. I'll be just focusing upon files as of now, because obviously, the session is SharePoint, and hence we'll be just focusing upon SharePoint and OneDrive. And later on, I'll be also showing you experience for groups and sites. So for this one, I'll just choose items as a file. You can extend your sensitivity label, offering it with the encryption. So let's say I want to have encryption in place once I enable the sensitivity label for my end users, and I also want to have the content marking. I'll go next. I say I want to provide encryption right now. So that means I'm defining what all users can do with a content when they receive a content with this sensitivity label applied on it. So I am applying the permissions right now when defining the sensitivity label. That's one thing I'm going to do. So user access to the content expire. Do I really wish that once I share the file with a user, for an example, if I talk about the business use case, let's say you have a project which is running for 6 months, and after that it's going to be over. You say, okay, all the users will lose the access after 6 months, for an example. Allow offline access, so you would still be able to allow users to have access to the files in offline mode. Offline doesn't mean so always doesn't mean literally always. It's like 30 days. After 30 days, user will have to re-authenticate, and next 30 days cycle will be initiated. I would say that. Here, you need to provide the permission. So if I say add all users and groups, it will take my users which falls into my domain. So all the users would have permission to the content once they have access to the content with the help of sensitivity label, because I am defining that entire my domain or the users falling into my domain, they would have access onto the content. Now, what level of access they would have once they receive a content? So by default, it's co-author, so they can do everything. They can view, they can edit, they can print, they can reply, they can forward, but they cannot change the label. You do have different flavors of the permissions as well. It's co-author as well. If you grant co-author, we would not recommend unless you have a business case. Then they would also be able to change the label on the existing content once they receive the content. And then if you need to create your custom permissions, you would be able to create your custom permissions as well. So for the time being, I'll say, I just need to make sure I will provide co-author to my entire organization. You can choose add authenticated users. Any user who would be able to authenticate would have access to the content once this label will be applied. You can add specific users or the group. So for an example, you want to leverage this label to a sales department, or let's say for a marketing department, you are just rolling them, so you just add them into this. Specific email address. Let's say you have a channel partner or a vendor partner which you want to extend this label for. So you can say xyz.com, or for an example, anything, abz.com. And then once those users will receive this file or a content, they would have access, or they would be able to consume the content onto the file. I save it. So that means I have granted access to my entire tenant as a co-author. I'll move next. I can provide watermarking. I can provide header. I can provide footer. So for this demo, I'll just provide the footer. I would say confidential. I say save. Next. Now this is called as automatic labeling, and this is called as client-side auto labeling. I'm going to show you the server-side auto labeling as well. So based upon the content, you say the label will be applied automatically. So I would go in, I say, if the content contains sensitive info, and I choose credit card. So let's say if you're writing a document in a SharePoint or an email, for an example, if I have defined that the system will find the SIT, which is credit card information, it will apply the label automatically. It will apply this label automatically. So it's like automatically apply to the label, and you can offer the policy tip to the end user as well. However, there is one more mechanism. Rather being applying or enforcing the label automatically, you can recommend the label. So it would say that as per the organizational policy, it seems that it contains any sort of SIT, and the label is recommended. So we have a differentiate, I mean, in terms of applying the label or enforcing the label, or then recommending the label. But in both the scenarios, user would be able to change the label themselves. I will turn this off for the time being. This is also called as client-side labeling, for an example, and this is also called as automatic labeling. Now, these settings are associated with groups insights, I would say that, and hence we will go back and see what settings are available into groups insights. Now I choose groups insights as well. So I'm just skipping this because we have configured this already. Now, if I talk about the groups insight, we do have options to configure privacy. We do have an option to extend the label and configure external sharing capabilities with the help of conditional access policies as well. So let's say if you are applying this label on a container, let's say Office 365 group or a SharePoint or a Teams, you can say once this label is applied, what gonna be the privacy level? Is it like public or a preview? Or if you want user to choose themselves, is it like if you select none, then user would have leverage to select themselves? Do you wish the owner of the Office 365 group would be able to add guest or not within that Office 365 group? You can control that as well. Next, what is a sharing capability of the site once you apply this label on a site level? Whether it can the content would be able to share with anyone, new and existing guest, and only people in your site. This settings will supersede the settings what you have on a site level. That's really important. And then you can create a conditional access policy. If a user is coming from, let's say, an unmanaged device on a SharePoint site where you have applied this sensitivity label, whether he would have full access, whether he would have limited web access, or he would not have any access. So these are the capabilities you can offer and leverage within the sensitivity label, both for groups and also for the item label. But once this label is created, it's not the end of the story. You have to publish this label so people would be able to consume it. So I would go to a publish label. I would choose my label which I wish to publish. So let's say I pick any three, add a label. I go in, I pick my audience. Do I wish to leverage this label to all the users, like in terms of they would be able to see that into their SharePoint? Or I want to have a very specific audience for that, for a sales department, for a marketing department, which should not be available for other users. I would say for all users. Then you can say user must provide justification to remove labels or lower its classification. Let's say I have applied a confidential label and now I need to lower down the label to public or a general. I need to provide the justification, which is recorded into the unified audit logs as well with the description. Require users to apply a label to their email and documents. So if I really wish that users would be able, so this is called as mandatory labeling. Users would not be able to send an email or would save a document unless they will apply the label. So this is must to have label. Require users to apply labels on a Fabric or Power BI. That is also a scenario. And then help page. So at the end, you would have a help page where you can redirect user to a help page. It could be a SharePoint intranet page, providing guidance to the users. And hence, after this, you need to publish the policy. Once the policy is published, user would be able to consume the label once it is visible into the SharePoint. I'm going to show you the end user experience as well. But before I do so, I'll jump onto the service side automatic labeling as well before I forget that. So now I have shown you the client side automatic labeling. I'll go to policies, and we do have a flavor called as automatic labeling, which is called as service side labeling, to apply label on the documents sitting at rest on SharePoint and OneDrive. So I say I want to identify a document with a credit card information, and I want to apply a confidential label automatically, which is for the documents which is sitting at rest. So I will say custom. I would say let the name remain as is. And then I will go next. I'll choose a location where I want to target the sensitivity label automatically. I'll say all my SharePoint sites. I say next. I will write a rule, what I am looking for into a SharePoint repository. So before the rule gets triggered, I would say SharePoint rule. Add a condition. Now I'm looking for a documents or a content which contains credit card information. And this will look for a credit card information. And once the credit card information is found onto a SharePoint, depending upon what sources and what sites I have selected, I'll go next. It will ask me to choose a label. Now, what label I need to apply on the content when the sit will be found. I say I'll go and apply this confidential label. I go next. Okay, I'll change it because that's for the recipient only. So I will apply, let's say, all employee high confidential. I say next. And now it will run into a simulation mode, showcasing me all the results into the Content Explorer. And if I'm satisfied with the results, I can say turn on the policy and it will apply the label in a sequential manner. So this is called as applying the labels automatically onto the document sitting at rest. So that's the flavor of the sensitivity label. I know it's too short time to explain that because it's a long topic. A lot of planning and extensive discussion is required, but just still it'll provide you a glimpse. And now I'm going to show you the end user experience. If you have documents sitting onto the SharePoint, and also if you are applying label onto the app, you basically do have two flavors. This will look like this. The color coding or the labels, what you have configured. So one is assign permission. Now that I have assigned permission, I can also say let user assign the permission. So that means when a user will apply the label, they will choose what users need to have access on the content. For an example, if I go in, I say recipient only. And that can also be configured from the SharePoint, not the SharePoint, but the Purview portal while creating the label. It'll take 5 seconds to pop up the window if everything works fine. And then I'm going to show you the new modern look of window where you would be able to define the users who would have access onto this document if I'll share the document with them. So that's like viewers. I can define the viewers, I can define the restricted editors, I can define the editors, I can define the owners, and then we have more options there. I can ask for a request for the permissions, and then I can set the expiration date. But if I do not have the user defined label, I do have a normal label, which is like providing encryption to the end audience. I can just apply the label, save it, and I'm done with applying the label. But if I go to my SharePoint, let's say I'll go to my SharePoint, I create a document and want to apply a label to it. I create a document. And this is like on web. So I'm applying a label onto a SharePoint document library directly. So I have the labels available here. Okay, I'll wait. So it's personal, public, general, and confidential. So let's say if I apply confidential and then say all employees within the organization, and then I close the document, it will be applied automatically on this label. I say not leave the site, but cancel. And then if I do this, the label will be applied automatically once it has been fixed from this side. So I'll allow the access, and yes, the label is applied now, the confidential one, and it is reciprocated back into the sensitivity column that yes, the label has been applied. You can also apply a label on a document library level. I can do that, and if any document falling into this document library, it will inherit the label from the document library itself. So that's about sensitivity label in a nutshell, providing more encryption. But if I talk about applying the labels on a container level, I can actually go to my SharePoint site. I create a new SharePoint site for an example. And then I say SharePoint. I use this template. For example, I would say ESPC. We'll check the name and then apply the owner. I say next. And then it will offer me the labels as well, what I have leveraged onto my container level. So if I choose business confidential, you see it's public because I have infused that whenever user will provide business confidential, it will have a privacy as public. But if I choose high confidential, the privacy will be private, and based upon the other settings what I have shown will be implemented on the site level as well. Okay, then moving on next, I would say that without wasting a time, we do have information protection again. That's data loss prevention policy. I call this as non-persistent protection compared to the protection, which is offered by sensitivity label, the persistent protection. This is non-persistent because this is on the location based. So I am applying data loss prevention, stating if I have a document sitting onto my SharePoint which contains any sort of credit card information, that cannot be shared outside the organization. So that data loss is offered on a location. But if I try to download that content from the SharePoint, which is no longer available in SharePoint any longer, I can still share that outside the organization. So basically, it's a non-persistent protection till the time data remains at the periphery of the workload where you have applied the data loss prevention. When it comes to scope, we offer data loss prevention in various workloads. We have in Teams, we have in SharePoint, OneDrive, endpoints, device management as well. And then we have, Exchange as well. So there are various locations where we leverage data loss prevention in terms of what user can do with the content, which contains a sensitivity label, not label, but the sensitive information type. Whether they would be able to share it internally, whether they would be able to share externally. So you can define the rules. And when it comes to the data loss prevention is basically built upon conditions and actions. Obviously, the very first thing is locations where you are applying the data loss prevention. But if I talk about the condition, what is a condition? I mean, what you are looking for before there going to be any sort of enforcement and action provided onto the content. For an example, I'm looking for a document which is labeled as high confidential and also contains credit card information. And then you say the action is block the access for all the users. I'm going to show you that. So now let's jump onto the purview. I'm going to show you how we build it, and then what would be the end user experience when it comes to the data loss prevention. I go in here. I go to my, I just cancel this in the purview portal. I go to my solutions. I go to my data loss preventions. I'll go to my policies. Create a policy, for an example. I choose custom policy. Next, I would say SharePoint sit. So I'm basically looking for a sit on SharePoint. So when I talk about the scope or the locations, it's basically on multiple locations. When we started this journey, it was a limited location. So I'll just uncheck all the other location and choose SharePoint and OneDrive. I would say next. I create a rule. Now I need to define my rules in terms of the condition and the action and the enforcement. I would say next. I would say SharePoint rule. I'll add a condition that says I'm looking for either a sensitive info type, either a sensitivity labels, either a retention labels, or either a trainable classifiers. Then I would say, okay, let's go. I look for a sensitivity type or sensitivity label. If a document is classified as confidential, let's say for an example, and I will add more. If the document also contains credit card information, for an example, I'll just choose the set. Any of these or all of these, I select all of these. So my condition is I really want to have both, or I can say no, any one of these. For this one, for this demo, I say any one of this, even if the document would have both together or individual, the confidential label or a credit card information as a set. Now, what is the condition? So we have, these are the conditions what you can choose from. Contains, which I've shown you, whether it's a retention label you're looking for, sensitive information looking for, or a label looking for. You can also say whether the content is shared inside or outside the organization, and then you can have a lot of document properties and file extension where you can apply the rule. So this is created. So this is something I'm looking for. This is my condition. Once this condition is found, I can apply the action. Now, what is the action? I need to make sure I will block everyone accessing this file. So when I say everyone, I think the site admin, the last modifier, and the site owner would have access to the content. But apart from that, everyone will lose the access on the content. I would say save. You can also have policy tip, that's the inbuilt policy tip, and also the custom policy tip. I would say next. Now, do you want to run this in a simulation mode just for the admin perspective, or do you want to turn this on? I say turn this on. I say next, and I'm done with this. So that means I'm finished. I won't submit because I do have a similar policy, but I'm going to show you the end user experience out of it. Now, let's say I do have a document, might be on my OneDrive, which has been blocked by the policy, the same policy what I have created. Now, as an end user, if I go, I will find, so if I go to my files, so I have this red icon saying that this is a credit card information which has been blocked. And if I hover my mouse here, this is showing me the policy tip as well. So it's like contains sensitive information. So if I hover my mouse here and go to details of the file, so now only the owner, the last modifier, and the site admin would be able to access it. I say view policy tip, and then it says it contains the credit card information. Item contains the following sensitive information type, credit card number. So this is like more about you can have the default policy tip or you can have the custom policy tip as well. So basically now nobody would have access to this content apart from those three users, because you have constructed a rule stating if the system will find a sensitive info type and also a credit, let's say sensitivity label, then nobody would have access. Even the internal audience would not have access, and nobody would be able to share this content. So that's what data loss prevention will do to the content setting into your SharePoint. This is more non-persistent, but if I download this content locally, I would still be able to share that from an email, for an example. And to control that, we need to have the persistent information protection, which is in terms of sensitivity label. Apply the label directly onto a content, and then make sure you have a persistent data protection or encryption. Even if the document is going outside the organization, you are quite protected. So that's a brief around data loss prevention, I would say that, which now covered your information protection side of it, sensitivity label and data loss prevention. We'll move to the next one, which is data lifecycle management. We'll talk about retention policy, we'll talk about retention labels, we'll talk about the difference between retention policy and retention label, and also sensitivity labels versus retention label. So when I talk about the retention policies offer you the capability to retain the content based upon your business needs and business requirements. Like for an example, I know a lot of financial industry, they have obligation to retain customer data for 7 to 9 years, for an example, and you can create a policy despite the user is deleting the data, it will be going from their visibility, but at the end, the back end, it will still be retained for the compliance purposes. So that's called as retention policy. I'm going to show you the demo as well. So if I talk about, let's say you have a retention policy, and retention policy is not only retention policy, it comes along with a retention and deletion. So you can have retention, you can have deletion, you can have both together. So you can retain a content, you can delete a content. For an example, if I talk about one of the business case for the deletion, let's say you have a SharePoint site which is growing as monstrous, having a lot of terabytes of data, I would say that. And users, whenever they're searching, they're getting furious because they're getting the old legacy results, and your business says that, okay, we need to clean this up. Now it is almost next to impossible to reach out to all the individuals and owners to ask them clean this manually. You can create a deletion policy saying anything beyond 5 years, which is older than 5 years, just delete it. That's possible with the help of retention policy. So let's take an example. You have created a retention policy for 5-year retention and delete afterwards. And let's see how it works onto the SharePoint. For an example, you have a policy which is onto a SharePoint, and within the SharePoint, you have a document library where you repository the data or the save the data. There's a timer job running here. Let's say if somebody tries to delete the data before 5 years, it will be sent to a preservation hold library, which is only visible to the site admin. Now, before, back in the days, it was actually visible directly, but now it's a backdoor entry. You need to know the URL of the preservation hold library, and then only you would be able to see that. It will be saved into the preservation hold library. So basically, it has been cleaned up from the document library, sitting onto a preservation hold library. There is a timer job which says Okay, now the instruction is to keep the document for 5 years. I will keep it for 5 years, and after that, the instruction is to delete it, and then it will be sent to a recycle bin for 93 days, and it will be cleaned permanently. If the document is not cleaned up for let's say 5 years, it is still sitting into the document library. There is a timer job which says the instruction is to keep the document for 5 years and delete it afterwards. It will delete the document by sending it to the recycle bin for 93 days and deleting it afterwards. So this is how the retention policy works. I will show you now what gonna be the admin perspective. If I go to my purview portal, I will go to my solutions. I will go to my data lifecycle management, and let's create our retention policy. So I'll go within the policy, I'll go to my policies, new policy. I would say SharePoint for an example. I say next. Uh, and then I will go to, there are scope called as adaptive and static. So adaptive is more about attributes which is coming from your Azure or I would say now Entra ID. So you can specify that this is only applicable for users sitting into the sales department or the marketing department. And then their OneDrives will be covered automatically. Or you can say, okay, the sites which are starting with XYZ name, only those sites are covered. So this is more, you are providing the filtration and the selection based upon the attributes. But if I say static, it will go and offer me the retention policy on different platforms. I would say the workloads. I'll focus only on SharePoint. So I will go SharePoint Classic. I will go modern SharePoint. I will go OneDrive. So all my SharePoint and OneDrive is covered, whether it's classic communication site and a modern SharePoint site. I would say I need to retain a data for 7 years. Now, there are two things. One, you are retaining content from the date when it is created or landed into SharePoint. That's really important. The one is when it is last modified. For my business critical customers, I mean, I always refer that you need to have this setting, like, when items were last modified, so that if you have a business critical site, every time the document is modified, the retention period will be recycled to 7 days automatically. So I would say this one. Now, do delete items automatically. So it will retain the items for 7 years, and after that, it will start doing the cleanup. If you really want the retention policy not to do anything, say do nothing. So that means it will retain the content for 7 years, and once the 7 years is over, we will not retain your content. Rather, we will also not delete your content. Your content will remain as is in place into your SharePoint or OneDrive. So basically, it will just be retained for 7 years, and then we will not clean it up. You also have option to retain items forever if you want, if you have any sort of business obligations or reasons. You also have option to clean or delete the content. Let's say anything which is older than 7 years, when it is created, you have to clean it. So this is the deletion capability of retention and deletion. I'll go back to the retention one. I say next. And when I submit it, all the workloads what I have mentioned will be covered within my retention policy. This is more from the administrative and compliance perspective. Users might or might not aware that there is a retention policy. You have from the purview portal running in, because this is more for the admins and compliance reasons. So even if the users are deleting the content, they can do whatever they want to do as is, deleting and creating the content. But from the compliance perspective, you are actually going to retain the content, and you can have that content rendered from the e-discovery if you have the e-discovery rights. So that's the retention part of it. Now, in the retention part, we also have retention labels, which is more in favors of the end user. So it's something you will leverage to the end user to consume, and based upon the criticality of the document, users will apply the retention labels themselves. You have two flavors. One is to apply retention label manually, and one is to apply retention label automatically. So let's go and see how retention label works. So I'll go to my retention label. I create a label here for my end user, because it's more for the end user, because end user would be able to see that and apply that based upon that. So I would say, let's say 1 year. So you can create 1 year retention, 2 year retention, 3 year retention based upon your requirements. I say just 1 year. Retain item forever for a specific period. So same look and feel what you had in retention policy, but one change, a little bit change. I say I want to retain a content for 5 years. Once this label is applied onto the content, irrespective whether I do have retention policy or not. Obviously, retention will win over the deletion. That's one thing, and implicit retention will always. So the explicit retention will always win over implicit. So the retention for the retention label will always win over retention policy. However, the longest retention will always win. So then you have when items were created. So that means you are applying a label, it will retain from the time when the item is created, 5 years. Last modified, which was also there into a retention policy. Then you have when items were labeled. So that means when you apply this label on a content, then from there in the 5 years will be counted. And then you have the same options, delete the items automatically afterwards, start disposition review. This I'll be covering shortly because this is more around the record management, which I will be covering. Change the label after 5 years. So you can say, okay, from label A to B after 5 years, that's possible. Run a power automate, maybe intimating the owner that, okay, the 5 years or the 7 years has been lapsed. Now, do you want to wish or change anything into the label? So you can have power automate running at the end of the life cycle as well, and deactivate the retention, which is quite similar to as do not do nothing, so that the content is retained for 5 years, and after that we won't retain the content, but it will remain as is in place. So that's one thing. Once you will create this, if I go back, if I go one back, enforce action after a specific period, so you can specify the specific period as well, like straight away 5 years, and then when the items were created, last modified, and labels without any sort of additional information what I have showed you into the previous screen, and just label. You can just classify the document without having any sort of retention as well, and you can find all those documents from the content search if it is required for the compliance reasons. Once the label is created, let's say if I choose this one, I choose this, I choose this, I say delete automatically. Once the label is created, you actually have to go and publish the label as well. So you will go into, let's say I will go publish a label, choose a label. I would say, for example, these two, so that user can consume the label and it will be visible for them as well. And then again, you have the adaptive scope depending upon the attributes, and you have a static. Then you only have 4 workloads, offered by the retention label, and those are Office 365 Group, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Exchange. I would say next, and once I will publish this, after this, it will be able, users will be able to consume it. From a SharePoint perspective or standpoint, if I go in, I create a document for an example. I just say this is my test document for an example. Let's say I say test. Okay, I'll close this. I try to refresh the screen. I have my test document. I choose my document, and then I go to my information pane here, and it's gonna show me all the labels which is available. So here is my labels which is available in my tenant. So I would say, let's say retain for 2 years. Now, once I apply this, I also have this infused within my retention label. So now this document will be retained for 2 years. Even if I delete it, let's say if I try to delete it, let's say delete, it will be gone. So it's deleted, but at the back end, it is preserved in the preservation hold library. So either an admin or either an e-discovery owner would still be able to recover my document. So that's the magic of retention label. But it's so the difference between retention policy and label is retention policy is more for the governance and compliance reasons, where you would be applying onto the entire workload, let's say a SharePoint or an Exchange or a OneDrive or a Teams, retention label is more in favor of the user. So user will leverage the retention label and apply different retention labels basis on the criticality of the document. Again, the retention will always win over deletion, but the explicit retention will win over the implicit one. So that's how the retention label will work when it comes to SharePoint. Now, in extension of that, you can also apply retention labels onto a document library level. For example, if I go to a library settings, I say more library. Let's say you have a business critical document library level and you have to retain everything for 5 years, for an example. I apply a label. I say I want to retain the content for 5 years and apply this to all the documents which is sitting inside the document library. I say save. So if I now create a document, the label will be applied automatically. So just to show you that, I say test2 and I name this as test2 as well. I delete this. I refresh this. You see, the label is applied automatically. So that's the power of applying labels automatically onto a document library level, because it will inherit the label from the document library. But apart from that, you can also apply labels automatically depending upon the sits. So if I cancel this, if I go to my, let's say, policies, and go in here just to refresh. So I have auto apply label. So depending upon the sit, the label will be applied automatically. So you can just define it here and run it into the simulation mode as well. So I say sit credit card, for an example. I say next. Apply the label to a content that contains sensitive info. That's one thing. So you can define, okay, if the document contains sensitive info, like for an example, SSN number, for an example, national security number, credit card information. You can specify if the document contain any sort of keywords, maybe contractual information, invoice number, for an example. The label will be applied automatically. Trainable classifiers, and also you have apply label to cloud attachment if that is required. So I say, if a document contains custom, I add a sensitive info type. Let's make a little bit difference, US social security number, next. And then which label I need to apply. I would say on static, and I choose, I want to have this only for SharePoint and OneDrive. So that means any document with a SSN number will be applied a label, but which label? And then I can choose, okay, I want to retain that for 5 years. And this label will be applied automatically onto the content. You can run it right away. You can also run it into a simulation mode. So that's how the automatic retention label will work. Now, you also have a second flavor to it, which is called as record management, where you can define your records. Now, which is this one. So we have covered all the topics here. We have gone through retention policies. We have gone through retention scope, difference between retention policy and retention label, manual versus automatic. The last thing is I've also shown you the experience. The difference between sensitivity label and retention label is sensitivity label is providing encryption and watermarking and protection to the content, wherein retention labels will be providing or leveraging retention to the content. So you would be able to retain the content. The next one, the last topic, is record management, which we will be talking about record versus regulatory record. We'll be talking about disposition review and event-based retention, and I'm going to show you a couple of demos as well. So let's talk about what can be a potential business case for record management or defining my document as record. For an example, you have a business contract which is signed in, and you really want nobody would be able to change the terms and condition for next 5 years till the time you have the business contract boiling down. and you really want to freeze it. Nobody would be able to delete it. Nobody would be able to change anything. And in those reasons, you can apply the label called as a record to the content. So it is like sort of freezed out for next 5 years. Nobody would be able to make any sort of changes. Now let's go and see how to create it. And I'm going to show you the end user experience as well. I'll cancel this. I'll go to my solutions. I'll go to my record management, which is E5 functionality, just in case. And if I talk about the sensitivity labels automatically, that's E5. If I talk about the retention labels automatically, all are E5 functionality. I'll go to the policy. I'll go to my file plan to create a retention label. So record management will be on top of the retention label. So they are built up on top of the retention label itself. So I would say record for 5 years for an example. Next, I will say retain items forever or for a specific period of time. I would say I need to retain for, let's say, 5 years when the item is created. And next, it will leverage me whether I want to define this as a record. So when I say yes, I want to define this as a record. So that means once I apply this record onto a document, it is some sort of immutable. I mean, nobody would be able to change it. Nobody would be able to delete it. For an example, if I go to my ECS, I create my document. Let's say I name the document as record. I say close it. I refresh the screen. I have record here, and now I need to classify, or now I need to apply the label. I'll go in here. I say apply the label, and the label gonna be record for 7 years. And then it is locked. You see the lock sign here? That's been locked. If I try to delete this, let's say I delete it. I cannot delete it. I just cannot delete it. Now let's see if there is a business contract written down, and obviously if I try to open it, I would only be able to view this in a view mode or a read mode. I cannot even make the changes. So I cannot just make the changes here as well. So I'm just typing from my screen and I'm not able to make any sort of changes because it's in a readable format. I go next. Let's say I want to change the terms and condition in the contract. I go next here. You have this lock button. I say unlock. I now open the contract. I can make the changes now. Now I can say change 1 for an example, and change is made. I just close it and then I go back and lock it again. Even if this is locked, I can still not delete it. So if I try to delete it when it is unlocked, I cannot still delete it. I cannot. Then I lock it. So both lock and unlock, I just cannot delete it. It's some sort of integration error, but users who have contributor and more rights would be able to lock and unlock the document, and every time they do so, the record will be created into the unified audit log as well. So you know who is changing. SharePoint owner or the admin of the site would be able to change the label from record to any other. So if I go in here now, this is my record. If I want to make the change and say, no, I don't want to configure this as a record, that was my mistake, it should be retained for 5 years. I can do that. And now if I try to delete, I can delete it. So let's say delete, I would be able to delete it. But now I do have a retention policy on top of my SharePoint, so it will be going to a preservation hold library. So that's one of the fine example of the record. Now, apart from that, you have a regulatory record. Regulatory record is not available by default into your tenant. So that's this one. You have to only enable via partial. So if you go to your tenants, you might not find it because you haven't enabled from the partial. Once the label is created, you cannot delete it. You can only increase the retention period, and hence it will give you the one. If you apply this label onto a document. Let's say I will go in here. I would say, for an example, I will rename this. And then you have regulatory here. I'll apply the regulatory label. It will give me the warning again that are you sure you want to apply that? Because once you apply the regulatory label, nor you, nor admin, nor global admin would be able to change it. It will be completely freezed out. So if I go in here, so it's a regulatory record, it'll offer me the warning. After it's been applied, you won't be able to make any sort of edit or change it, or nobody would be, even if you're a global admin, won't be able to make the changes. I say apply. Now the label is applied. Lock is always locked. I cannot unlock it. And even if I'm a global admin, I cannot change the label for next 5 years or 7 years, whatever I have defined within the regulatory record. So even I cannot change it now. It's been completely freezed out for next 5 to 7 years, whatever time span you have mentioned into the settings. So that's around the record management. But however, if I talk about the record management, if I say cancel, I say retain, I say next, you can start a disposition review. What will happen once the retention period will be lapsed? Like what will happen after the 5 years has been lapsed? You can say, okay, after 5 years, do not delete anything, do not do anything. Rather send an email to a reviewer to review the document. And the reviewer will receive an email and he would have 3 options, either to change the label, saying that, okay, I still want to retain it, go from A to B, delete the confirmation, or extend the retention period, saying, okay, no, I still want to retain this for next 6 months. So that's possible. So that's the disposition review. Apart from that, you also have one more hidden gem here, which is based upon the event. So let's say one of the fine example for this is, let's say you have a user who is leaving the organization, and your organization would have the obligation to retain the content for 1 year once the user will leave. So that means let's imagine the user is leaving on 30th of October, and from 30th of October, you have to start 1 year retention period, and then in that case you would be creating the retention label as event. So you will apply this to a document, and once the event will start, so that's 30th of October, from that day the document will be retained for 1 year. So those are the topics as part of the record management as well. So difference between the record and the regulatory record is record something you would define your data as record, but you would be able to make the changes by locking and unlocking. That's one thing. You can apply record as automatic record as well, but you cannot apply regulatory record as the automatic labeling. You cannot change regulatory record once it's been applied. You can still change record once it's been applied if you're a site admin, and if you do have contributor rights and more rights, you can still do the locking and unlockings. Now it's time for the questions, if you have any.
Thank you, Aman, for a great presentation demos. So we'll now get into questions and answers part. Should you wish to ask a question, please feel free to type in the questions box now. First question is, now we have a lot of questions coming in, Aman, just to let you know.
Yeah, no worries.
If you upload a document in a SharePoint site marked with confidential, will the uploaded document automatically assigned with confidential as default?
So there are two things. Once you have the label applied from your desktop app, and if you go in and upload that document onto a SharePoint, it will retain the label as is. However, you might have the let's say label applied onto a document library. It won't be making changes to the document. It will only make the changes to a document once the document is not labeled. So if any document coming in without any sort of label, then the document will inherit the label from a document library level. But if it's already been applied, it won't. However, it also depends upon the hierarchy. If there is a higher hierarchy onto the document library level, it will change the label to the label which has been already applied, which is at the lower hierarchy.
Perfect. So this next one there is, I see you have the new look and feel for labels with a DLP policy connected to it. When you apply it to a document, can I enforce this new look and feel to my organization, or do I have to wait for it to be rolled out to our organization?
Can you read that one more time, please?
Yeah,
Just
I,
so I understand correctly.
yeah, I see you have the new look and feel for labels with a DLP policy connected to it when you apply to a document. Can I
Mhm.
enforce this new look and feel to my organization, or do I have to wait for it to be rolled out to our organization?
You don't have to wait for that. You don't have to wait. I mean, both are quite separate functionalities when it comes to DLP and the retentions. But you can still go ahead and apply individual functionality when it is available for the users to consume within the Purview portal. So that's altogether independent. However, you can integrate them with each other depending upon the business rules and business requirement. That's possible, but they're quite independent and matured enough to be consumed separately.
Perfect. So just the next question there is content that is deleted as a result of a retention policy sent to recycle bin of the site where it can still be recovered, or is it permanently deleted with no way to recover it?
No. So if you have a retention policy and if a user will delete the content, it will go to a recycle bin. It will long last there for 93 days. After that, it will be cleaned up. But let's say if you have a retention period for 5 years, it will still be retained for next 5 years into a preservation hold library. And the preservation library can only be accessed via two users. One is the site admin that's hidden. So he need to have the URL for the preservation hold library, or the second one if you have the e-discovery rights, but it will still be retained for 5 years, although it will still be cleaned up for from the recycle bin.
Perfect. So just the next question there is, are the labels only affect SharePoint Classic and communication sites only? It means for SharePoint team site and teams, we should create another label.
So when it comes to the label, so I'm assuming the question is for the retention labels here, because then there is a bifurcation, just assuming. So for the retention label, yes, you have to include Office 365 groups for the modern SharePoint sites, wherein you have to use scope as SharePoint and the communication site to have all your communication sites and classic sites available for the retention label. So those are different two scopes, when it comes to the retention label. Yes.
Perfect. So just the next question there is, in your opinion, why is the adoption of sensitivity labels still low?
I would depend upon, when it comes to the adoption part, there are a lot of organization which is using the retention, sensitivity label, I would say that, but it also depends upon the organization internal adoption communication policy, how they want to seize it. But apart from that, I would have a lot of organization using the sensitivity label at very, very higher rate. And if I talk about the sensitivity label, I mean, the implementation part is a little bit easy, but it's more about adoption and how you get the return on the money when the users are consuming it. But I won't think that, the adoption part is a little bit low when it comes to sensitivity label. It's all about how you run the adoption internally, create the champions, who would be able to reach out to the users and see why they're not using it. Or maybe the best part is apply the mandate labeling, or let's say the default labeling. So both are available where user will be enforced to have the label applied and do have your help page created. So the user will be able to learn from the help page moving forward. So it's more about providing the adoption, providing the resources to the audience and making sure they will use it. To have it, you need to make sure you will apply the mandate labeling or a default labeling on. So every time they will have a document, it will be applied automatically.
Perfect. So just the next question there is, where can we see the preservation library path?
So preservation library path was into the site settings earlier, but now if you go to the site setting, it's no longer there. But if you go to the Google, just write down the shortcut to the preservation hold library, you'll get the shortcut to the preservation hold library. You need to amend your URL with that, and you will be into a preservation hold library, but you need to be site admin for that.
Perfect. So just the next question there is, when item is marked as record, is this so-called immutable record, which may suffice some regularity requirements or having it revision secured?
Yes, it is immutable. So every time you are changing the locking and unlocking, there is a different version created again back into a preservation hold library. You would not be able to delete it till the time you have the record available there. That's one thing. And you can still change it. I mean, in terms of if you say, okay, no, I do not wish that this document should be record labeled. This should be like a normal label that can be done. But that's for that, you need to have SharePoint admin rights. But for the time being, the document is marked as record. There is a preservation hold library entry for that as well. But if I talk about the regular record, you cannot change it, and it will be immutable for next 5 or 7 years, whatever policy would have created for the regulatory record. So it depends whether it's a record versus the regulatory record.
Aman, we have a good few questions that I know we're short on time. Is there any chance they'd be able to directly message you about their
That
questions,
should be
or
fine.
does that
That should be
suit?
fine. Yeah, they can reach out me directly. That should be absolutely fine.
On LinkedIn, or is that the best one? Is it?
LinkedIn should be appropriate. If you would be reaching me to the LinkedIn, that should be absolutely fine with me. And I'll make sure I'll find a time during today or in next 2 3 days. But I'll make sure you will get all your answered, questions answered. That should be fine
Perfect.
with me.
Appreciate that, Aman. We just have a lot of questions in. I appreciate that.
So just reach out. Feel free to connect me with on LinkedIn, and I'll make sure that your questions will be answered there and there.
Perfect. So on behalf of the ESPC community, we'd like to extend a big thank you to you again, Aman, for taking the time out today to carry this webinar. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day. Take care. Bye.
Perfect. So that's the end of today's webinar. You'll find this webinar and more at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. Thanks again for y'all for joining us today, and I hope you join us again soon. Take care.